So let's jump right in. We're looking at this really radical idea coming out of Japan, and it gets to the very heart of how we think about democracy. The question is simple. Should politicians get paid the same as the average person they represent? It's a debate that honestly forces all of us to ask what we really want from our leaders. And it all boils down to this one very basic question. Are politicians just paid too much? It sounds simple, right? But once you start digging into it, you realize the answer has these huge, complex ripple effects. Okay, so let's put a real number on this. A member of Japan's Diet, their parliament, makes around 21 million yen a year, and that's before you even factor in all the various allowances. Now think about that. In a country that's been dealing with a sluggish economy, that kind of salary, which is way, way higher than what the average person makes, well, you can see why it's the spark that just lit this whole fire.
And this whole thing very quickly stops being about the money and becomes a question of philosophy. For the people who want the cut, it's this powerful sign of solidarity. But for those against it, it's a genuinely dangerous idea that could weaken democracy itself. I mean, we're talking about two totally opposite ways of looking at the exact same action.
So that brings us to our first big theme here. Trust. Is cutting their pay a real way to rebuild that connection between politicians and the public? Or is it all just, political theater? The argument for the cut is pretty straightforward, right? If you earn what we earn, you feel our struggles, and that builds back trust. But the counter-argument just flips that completely on its head. They say, hold on, trust isn't about sharing pain, it's about getting results. They believe a symbolic pay cut, if it doesn't lead to better policies, is worse than useless. It's just a performance. And this quote really gets to the heart of the pro-cut side. They don't see the salary cut as the final goal. No, for them, it's that absolutely critical first step. It's a message to a public that's pretty skeptical, saying, hey, we're on the same level as you now. We're ready to listen. But then you have the other side, and they're warning about a serious backlash. They're saying, look, if politicians take this pay cut, but then they still can't solve the huge problems, we're talking pensions, the aging population, the economy, then people aren't going to be impressed. They're going to be even more disappointed because that one big gesture turned out to mean nothing. And that leads us right into our next big theme, the price of talent. Is a lower salary going to attract genuine public servants who have a real sense of mission, or is it just going to scare away the very experts a country needs to tackle its biggest challenges? So here you have these two completely different visions of what a good politician even is. One side says, let's get people in here who are driven purely by a mission, not by the paycheck. But the other side is worried that this will just slam the door on essential experts, doctors, lawyers, top economists, who simply can't afford to take a massive pay cut to go into government. Yeah, the pro-cut argument really doubles down on this. They believe that the number one qualification for holding office shouldn't be your fancy resume, but your raw dedication and passion to serve the people. For them, a lower salary is basically a filter to find exactly those kinds of people. But here's the crazy paradox the anti-cut side points out. They argue that if you make the salary too low to actually live on, while also paying for all your political activities, well, the only people who can afford to be politicians are the ones who are already rich. So in an attempt to make things more equal, you could accidentally make your government less diverse and more elitist, a total backfire. Okay, this brings us to what is probably the most heated part of this whole debate, corruption. And it's a classic dilemma, right? Does paying politicians a lot of money keep them honest, or does it just make them totally out of touch? So those who are against the pay cut, they use this really powerful metaphor. They say a high salary is a firewall. It's like a necessary shield that gives politicians financial independence so they aren't tempted by bribes or forced to rely on shady funding just to do their jobs. And they lay out what they see as a really dangerous chain reaction. It goes like this. Step 1, you cut the salary. Step 2, politicians realize they don't have enough money for their political work. Step 3, they have to start relying on these murky outside sources for funding. And step 4, the risk of corruption just goes through the roof. But the other side, they just completely reject that entire idea. They argue that corruption has nothing to do with your salary. It's about your personal character, your ethics. If someone is determined to be corrupt, a big paycheck isn't going to stop them. The real solution, they say, is lower pay combined with intense public scrutiny. That's what keeps people honest. So when you look at all these angles, trust, talent, corruption, This whole debate really forces us to take a step back and ask a much bigger, more fundamental question about what the role of a politician in society even is. And really, the entire debate boils down to this choice between two competing visions. On one hand, do we see a politician's salary as compensation for a super specialized, high-stakes job, something that needs to be competitive? Or is it more like a stipend for a public servant, something that's intentionally meant to keep them grounded in the day-to-day reality of the citizens they represent? So, to sum up one vision, this pay cut is so much more than just saving some money. It's a huge symbolic gesture. It's meant to be that one crucial first step toward finally closing that massive gap that's grown between the political class and everyday people. And the other vision? Well, it's that this whole debate is nothing more than a populist distraction. It's a simple, feel-good answer that conveniently lets everyone avoid the much harder and more complicated work of actually governing and passing policies that will make a real difference in people's lives. And so, we're left with this one final, really crucial question that I think we all have to ask ourselves. What do we really demand from our leaders? Is it empathy, the kind that comes from a shared struggle? Or is it expertise, the kind that's needed to solve our most complex problems? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.